Good afternoon. Senator Guglielmo, Representative Rengia, Representative Straczynski, and members of the Public Safety Committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for granting a public hearing to HB 5174, an act increasing the penalty for the assault on an off-duty police officer and a correction officer, and also HB 6715, which would increase the penalty for intentionally injuring and killing a police canine. Regarding the latter, the police canine bill, Senator Wong couldn't be here today. He wanted to testify on this also. It just moves it up from a Class D felony to a Class C felony. We've had a couple attacks around the country, and I think there was one in Connecticut, and Representative Senator Wong had that information, but he can get that to the committee later today or tomorrow. As far as the former, the off-duty police officer bill, I know you're all familiar with it. It's been passed out of this committee almost unanimously the last few years. It passed out of the Judiciary unanimously. For some reason, it's not being called on the House floor. We're going to keep trying. Briefly, I know you've heard this story before, but we had a horrendous attack in Greenwich on an off-duty cop who was known to the assailants as an off-duty cop. He was attacked because he was an off-duty cop. They were caught on tape in the jail saying that they knew he was a cop and that they were going to come back and finish the job if he spoke. So that was the inspiration for the bill. But I just want to clear up a misunderstanding. A few people last year in the General Assembly had remarked to me, and it was overwhelmingly supported the bill, but a couple of people said, well, we really don't want to create policy based on one incident. But there hasn't been one incident. There's been at least 5 that I know of in Connecticut, and I can get you those incidents where people are targeted because they're in law enforcement. And the bill's very carefully crafted. It does not, if someone's acting up as out in a bar, they're off duty and they're drinking and causing trouble, they would not be covered by this. So we want to make it very narrowly tailored, so only those instances where someone has been targeted because they were in law enforcement. And let's face it, as one of the gentlemen said before, they're never really off duty. They really aren't. And it's a benefit for all of us for their service and to have them in public venues if they see something going on. And that's what happened in Greenwich. The officer saw what was going on, and they were roughing up somebody in a restaurant, and they quickly turned their attention to the officer, identified him as an officer, and then beat him up, and he lost 1.5 years of work. But I'll gladly take any questions on this. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, Representative Vail.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Representative, and I want to thank you personally for adding correction officers. As you know, I'm a former correction officer, and I think the same thing applies. I think it's really important that scope is very narrow, though, and it only applies when an attack occurs specifically because the person was an officer or a correction officer, and that it doesn't expand beyond that. And I think that's important. And I wanted to ask you one question. Would this apply to retired corrections and police officers as well, or is just off-duty of active?
I believe it's just active, unless that has been changed. But there may be another bill floating around regarding retired. But certainly I would be supportive of that too, because as Representative Rengia, being an ex-officer, no, sometimes being an ex-correction officer, sometimes incidents happen and people don't forget. And as time goes on, you may move on with your life, but somebody doesn't, and that's always hanging over their head. So I would certainly be supportive of that.
Well, even having my personal experience, I've never had any major incidents, but I have been recognized and maybe some words or something like that. And so I definitely understand the need for that, but I think that should apply to retired officers and as well. I think anyone that put their life on the line to protect us in this state should have them certain protections from that type of behavior. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Rivero.
I think this is a wonderful bill, but I think maybe we should add a little bit more to it. And I'm going to give you an example. I was on the board of directors at a bank, and we had a loan officer almost lose his life because he foreclosed on someone's home for non-payment and so forth, and that person saw him and his wife out, and he almost lost a life because of it. So it's not taken away from police officers, but this doesn't just happen to police officers. Anybody that's in the authority that does something that somebody don't like, and it usually happens at a bar, we all know that. Somebody's had a few pops, and this loan officer was out of work for almost a year. So I like the bill, but I think maybe sometime you ought to think of adding other people into this. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Representative. Now, I agree with you. I think for our purposes here, we could almost expand this to almost every profession. I umpired baseball for about 32 years, and finishing up, it's never happened to me, but I've seen people hold grudges and be attacked in my lifetime, even when I was playing. I think we probably should keep that. I agree with you 100%, but I think we probably should keep it separate because the bill would go on and on and on. And that legislators too, probably.
Thank you. Senator Gomes?
I just listened to you, and like you said, it could go on and on and on. I'm for police officers and people who have been identified and you got attacked because of that. But a police officer or somebody that worked a job like Representative Vale said that he worked a job as a officer in a jail or something like that. He might get in a dispute with somebody, and the fellow didn't know what his job was in the past, and I don't want him to. I don't want him to be charged with a D felony because he got in a beef with somebody, and I don't think you can cover a host of people in this with this bill because it has to be somebody that would be expected to be challenged with some sort of danger because of the type of job you had, you know. But the thing with it is, I'd say this bill has to be narrowed down to the police officer, and a person knowing that they were attacking the police officer like these chumps here were doing. But other than that, I wouldn't have a wide open thing on a bill that would give a Class D felony to a person who got in a beef with a police officer and didn't know it was a police officer. It's just two people in a fight, you know.
Thank you, Senator, and that's why the bill is written the way it is for that reason, because you could end up in a situation where it could be an off-duty police officer who was in a bar, and it just ends up being a fight. It happens. And you don't want somebody getting an extra charge because the person just happened to be a police officer. They would have to be identifiable, and that would have to be the reason for. And it's a high burden. I mean, unless they're caught saying something, which would happen in Greenwich, and then I guess 4 other cases around the state. But yeah, it's very narrowly written for that reason. That's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
This is a question. I guess I was here a year or 2 ago when the gentleman came from Greenwich and testified on this. And I think this went to court in Greenwich. And the judge didn't really see the way the officer explained it to us. I think the guys got off with probation because he was unable to identify himself as a police officer, even though he assumed that they recognized him. And they repeated something, but I think he didn't have his ID with him, and they went to court. And the judge, I think he handled it as fighting the bar, and the guys didn't get as much punishment as the officer would wish they had because he was an officer.
Thank you, Representative Adams. No, he did identify himself. They actually identified him first, and he admitted that because they had worked at another restaurant and he had worked there.
Okay.
So they knew that, and it was premeditated. There was no doubt. In fact, the evidence in the jail of them on the tape, it took a long time for the judge to even admit that. Finally, he did into evidence. He wouldn't for the longest time, and then this guy lost 1.5 years of his work life. And they got probation, and that's a whole nother issue on sentencing. But certainly, when it's a fact and you have witnesses and they identified, there was no misunderstanding. He was a police officer. They knew it. They actually went to him first on that. So he was very upset about them not getting probation, and I would have been, and I'm sure you would have been too. Thank you for your question.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions from committee members? If not, thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much.
Next up, Chief Paul.